Dear learners, today we are going to deal about authorization and authentication, digital signature. Introduction. We have probably come across the terms authentication and authorization often in network security. While these terms are often used interchangeably, but are distinct since they are quite different from each other. Authentication and authorization both play significant roles in respect of information security, which enables the security by confirming the identity of users and then granting access to any website or application. The identity of an user is assured by authentication, whereas authorization gives access to specific services and or resources based on the permission given to an authenticated user. Learning objectives. By the end of this module, one will be able to come to know what is meant by authentication and authorization, have in-depth knowledge about the process involved in authentication and authorization, understand the concept of authentication and authorization through real-time example, recognize the key differences between authentication and authorization, have in-depth knowledge about what is digital signature and its basic requirements, to elaborate how the digital signature works and is created, to understand the importance of digital signature, drawbacks and its applications. Now, let us see what is meant by authentication and authorization. Authentication. This mechanism is used to determine the user's identity before revealing the sensitive information, since it is very crucial for the system where the user's priority is to protect the confidential information. In this process of authentication, the user's individual identity or an entity's identity is verified. In other words, authentication is the process that confirms a user's identity. The credentials verified could be username, password, biometric, etc. The authentication service is concerned in giving an user the confidence in the trustworthiness that a communication is genuine and reliable. Case 1. Single message. The function of the authentication service is to assure the recipient that the message is from the source that is to be from. Case 2. Interactive messages. The authentication service involves two aspects, namely, at the time of connection initiation, the service assures that both the entities are authentic, that is, both entities are that they claim to be. The service must guarantee that the connection between the concerned two entities is not interfered by a third party who can masquerade as one of the two legitimate entities in the intention of unauthorized transmission corruption. Types of authentication services. There are two types of authentication services defined in X.800, namely pure entity authentication. Pure entity authentication is responsible for confirming the identity of a poor entity in an association. Two entities are known as pure entities if they work with the same protocol in different systems. For example, two TCP modules in two communicating systems where two different communicating systems work with a TCP protocol. This type of authentication service is provided at the establishment of or at times during the data transfer phase of a connection to provide confidence that an entity is not subjected to a masquerade or an unauthorized replay of a previous connection. The next is the data origin authentication. Data origin authentication service is responsible for confirming the identity of the source of a data unit. It has nothing to do with the protection against replication or modification of data units, rather supports applications like electronic mail where there are no prior interactions between the communicating entities. For example, sender A sends an electronic document to the receiver B over the internet. For the system to identify that the sender A has sent a message dedicated to the receiver B and no intruder C has modified and replayed the document in order to trick or steal the information, the authentication service is done. At first, through data origin authentication ensures that the sender and receiver are righteous people. Secondly, through peer entity authentication ensures the security of the established connection between the sender and receiver with the help of secret session key so that it could not be intruded. Now, let us see about authorization. Once an user has been authenticated, the authorization process is used to determine what permissions are granted to an authenticated user. Permissions refers to what the user is able to do and see on the website or server, and without them every user would have the same privilege and access rights to the information. Authorization technique is used to check whether the user is permitted to access a particular resource or not by looking up the entries stored in the tables and databases of the respective user. For example, user X wants to access a specific file from the server. To verify whether user X is given the permission to access that specific file or not, authorization service is done. In the given example, the authorization mechanism is as follows. User X sends a request to the server. The server then verifies the identity of user X. The privileges of the authenticated user are checked to verify whether user X is allowed to access that specific file or not, including viewing, modification and deletion of the file. The processes involved in authentication and authorization. Authentication is used by a server when the server needs to know exactly who is accessing their information or site. Authentication is used by a client when the client needs to know that the server is the system it claims to be. In authentication, the user or computer has to prove its identity to the server or client. Usually, authentication by a server entails the use of a username and password. Other ways to authenticate can be through cards, retina scans, voice recognition and fingerprints. Authentication by a client usually involves the server giving a certificate to the client in which a trusted third party such as VeriSign or Thwart states that the server belongs to the entity such as a bank that the client expects it to. Authentication does not determine what tasks the individual can do or what files the individual can see. Authentication merely identifies and verifies who the person or system is. Authorization is a process for a server to determine if the client has the permission to use a particular resource or access to a file. Authorization is generally coupled with authentication, and the type of authentication required for authorization may vary. Authorization restricts free accounts from getting premium features so that every account has access to what capabilities they paid for. Now, let us see the real-time examples of authentication and authorization. Authentication and authorization are used in day-to-day activities of life as well as done together often. Done by people, example, booking and taking a flight. Authentication is done when a passenger shows the flight ticket and a photo ID proof at the airport to get the boarding pass. Airport authorities need to authenticate that the respective person is the one who has to take the flight before giving the boarding pass. Authorization is done when a person shows the boarding pass to the flight attendant to board the specific plane supposed to be flying on, and the flight attendant must authorize a person so that the person can see the inside of the plane and use the resources in the plane while flying from one place to the next. Next is what is done by the computers. For example, to view and access a e-commerce website. Authentication is done to know exactly who is using or viewing the e-commerce site by login before buying products, so they know exactly who their purchases are. Authorization is done to control viewer access of certain pages so that it prevents customers from seeing data of other customers. Now, let us have a view on the key differences between authentication and authorization. Authentication asks the question, who are you? Authorization asks the question, what are you allowed to do? Authentication checks identity of a person to grant access to the system. Authorization checks the privileges or permissions of the concerned person to access the resources. Authentication is performed as the first step. Authorization is generally performed after authentication. Authentication verifies the user credentials. Authorization validates the user permissions. Now, let us see about digital signature. In the fast-paced world of business, there is always the need for speeding up various processes that pertains to the optimization of efficiency while protecting the privacy of the business and its customers. The use of digital signatures has continued to grow as a means of meeting the needs for faster and more secure authentication that cannot be easily counterfeited. A digital signature is a mathematical technique used to validate the authenticity and integrity of a message, software or digital document with more inherent security, intended to solve the problem of tampering and impersonation in digital communications. The basic requirements of digital signature. The basic requirements of digital signature are: the first is the private key. The private key is used to generate the digital signature, which is then attached to the message and is accessible only to the signer. The next comes the public key. The public key is used for verification of the received message and is made available to all those who receive the signed messages from the sender. The next is digital signature certificate. The owner of the private key and public key pair makes the public key available to all those who are intended to receive the signed messages from the corresponding owner. But if any dispute rises between the two sides, there must be some entity with the receiver which will allow the receiver of the message to prove that the message was indeed sent by the owner of the key pair, which can be achieved with a digital signature certificate. Now, let us see how does a digital signature work. the digital signature is nothing but a numerical value that is represented as a sequence of characters, while the creation of digital signature is a complex mathematical process that can only be generated by a computer. Consider a scenario where A has to digitally sign a file or an email and send it to B. The file to be digitally signed is selected, or the sign option in the email application is clicked by A. A's computer calculates the hash value of the file content or the message. To create the digital signature, the hash value is encrypted with A's private key, which is also known as the signing key. The original file or the email along with the digital signature are sent to B. After the signed message is received by B, the email application identifies whether the message has been signed. B's computer now decrypts the digital signature using A's public key, calculates the hash of the original message and compare the hash it has computed from the received message with the decrypted hash received along with A's message. Any difference in the hash values discloses the tampering of the message. The digital signatures are based on public key cryptography and is asymmetric, since a public key algorithm such as RSA generate two keys that are mathematically linked, namely a private key and a public key. The user who creates the digital signature uses their own private key to encrypt signature related file or message, and the only way to decrypt that file or message is with the signer's public key. In simple words, private key is used for encryption and public key is used for decryption. Thus, the digital signatures are authenticated but requires all the parties to trust that the user who creates the signature keep their own private key secret, because if someone else has access to the signer's private key, that person could create fraudulent digital signatures in the name of the private key holder. Three algorithms are involved in the digital signature process, namely the key generation algorithm. The key generation algorithm, which provides a pair of keys, namely the private key and the public key. The signing algorithm, which produces a signature upon the receival of a private key and the file or message that is signed. The last one is the verification algorithm, which examines for the authenticity of the messages by verifying it along with the signature and the public key. Briefly, the process of digital signing requires that the signature generated by both the file or the message and the private key can be authenticated by its corresponding public key, such that the user's signature cannot be replicated without having access to their private key. By applying asymmetric cryptography methods, the digital signature process has the ability to prevent several common attacks where the attacker attempts to gain access through some of the attack methods, such as key only attack, where the attacker has access to the public key; known message attack, where the attacker has access to valid signatures for known messages alone; adaptive chosen message attack, where the attacker gains access to signatures on various messages that they have chosen, but not the secret signing key. Now, let us see how to create a digital signature. To provide authenticity, integrity and non-repudiation to electronic documents, in order to use the internet as the safe and secure medium for e-commerce and e-governance, digital signature is used. The digital signature on a e-document is nothing but the hash value of a message when encrypted with the private key of the sender. Hence, the digital signature varies from document to document, thus ensuring authenticity of the document, and as the public key of the signer is known, anybody can verify the message and the digital signature. To create a digital signature for an email message or file, a one-way hash of the electronic data to be signed is first created, and then the private key is used to encrypt the hash is the digital signature. A hash function is defined as a mathematical function that converts a numerical input value into another compressed numerical value, and the input to the hash function is of arbitrary length, but value returned is always of fixed length. The output returned by a hash function are called message digest or hash values. Hash functions are very useful and appear in almost all information security applications, since the value of a hash is unique to the hash data, since any change in the data will result in a different value. Digital signatures provide proof of authenticity, data integrity, and non-repudiation of communications and transactions conducted over the internet. Now, let us see about the importance of digital signature. Out of all cryptographic primitives, the digital signature using is considered as significant and useful tool to achieve information security, because apart from the ability to provide non-repudiation of message, the digital signature also provides message authentication and data integrity. Message authentication is achieved when the verification algorithm validates the digital signature using public key of the sender and assures that the signature has been created only by the sender, who possesses the corresponding secret private key, and not anyone else. Data integrity is achieved when the hash of the original data and the output provided by the verification algorithm matches, thus signifying that the data integrity is maintained. Suppose if an attacker has access to the data and modifies it, the digital signature verification at receiver end fails, because the hash of modified data and the output provided by the verification algorithm does not match, thus signifying the receiver to safely deny the messages, assuming that data integrity has been breached. Non-repudiation is achieved when the receiver could present the data and the digital signature to a third party as evidence if any dispute arises in the future, since it is assumed that only the signer has the knowledge of the signature key and is the only one who can create unique signature on a given data. The drawbacks of digital signature: the private key must be kept secured. The process of generation and verification of digital signature takes substantial amount of time. For using the digital signature, the user has to obtain private and public key, whereas the receiver has to obtain the digital signature certificate too. Now, let us see about the uses of digital signature. The beauty of digital signatures is that the digital signature can be used in so many sectors of life, such as personal use. One can always sign every email message or document sent out electronically for privacy and security purpose. Business: one can always send digitally signed documents to business partners, investors and other shareholders when communicating important official information, as well as while signing business deals and proposals, which makes the running of businesses very easy and smooth. Return filing for GST. With the introduction of GST in India, businesses have seen better days, but the filing of returns is what many people have had issues with, which is rectified with the issuance of digital signature and the availability of e-filing, making the process easier, faster, efficient and convenient. Let's summarize what we have seen. The authentication and authorization are the security measures taken in order to protect the data in the information system against fraudulent use. Authentication is the process of verifying the person's identity, whereas authorization is the process of checking the privileges or the access list of authenticated users. The success rate of various electronic mechanisms such as e-commerce, e-governance, e-learning, e-shopping, etc. is absolutely dependent on the security, authenticity and the integrity of the information that is being transmitted between the sender and the receiver is successfully achieved through the use of digital signature.